All right, good evening and happy Thursday, everyone. Welcome back to, I believe, the 28th or 27th or something like that episode of Scholars Forum on PatristiCast. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Jared Secord to the show. He is a coordinator of the Scholars Programming at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta. He's got a new book that he just published, that he co-authored, that he just showed me. I wasn't aware of it. We're not talking about that one today. We're going to talk about this one right here, Christian Intellectuals and the Roman Empire, from Justin Martyr to Origen. Dr. Secord, thank you very much for joining PatristiCast, and welcome.
Well, thank you very much, John. Happy to talk, and I've got my own copy of it here too, so I can refer to things if
You've got
necessary.
your own copy. So before we start, what's the image on the cover?
So the image on the cover, there's a little bit of an explanation on the back, but the image on the cover is one that if you go and see this one it's in Vienna. If you go and see it in the museum there, it actually does have a label, and it's often called the Bearded Barbarian. But there are different interpretations of what this one is. And I'll be honest, I'm not an art historian, so I don't know 100% exactly what might be the controversy and all of the latest opinions on this one. But one interpretation of it is that it is an intellectual. It's someone who is really wanting to make sure that he looks like a philosopher. And it's 2nd century CE. So for me, when I picked this image, what I was really aiming for was, there's this big component in the book about Justin Martyr. And obviously, if you read some of Justin Martyr's works, you get this big emphasis on Justin presenting himself as a philosopher. And there's that famous passage at the start of his dialogue with Trypho, where someone just recognizes him as a philosopher because he's dressed like one. He looks like one, basically. So what I really wanted with this image was I wanted to have an image of someone who looks like a philosopher, or who could plausibly be recognized as a philosopher in the 2nd century. And I'll be honest, too, I wanted to make sure that I picked an image that wasn't a stereotypical image of an early Christian martyr, or an early Christian figure, and the way that they tend to be depicted. If you go looking for images of Justin Martyr online and in different sorts of places, you typically see a guy who's got a halo over his head, right?
You see the icon,
Yeah, you see that, and that's not how Justin would have looked, actually, right? Justin would have looked more like this guy one way or another, basically. So yeah, that was something that was really key for me in terms of selecting an image for the front cover.
Yeah, and he was very famous for wearing that philosopher's cloak, kind of put him in that certain class of individuals, the class of intellectuals. So we'll get to Justin Martyr in a little bit, but first, I want to kind of, I guess, cite something that I think gets at the main idea of the book. And in early Christian studies, patristics, classics, what have you, there's a tradition of scholarship that sees in the 2nd and 3rd centuries a warming up of the empire towards Christianity. They start to get more sympathetic, maybe getting persuaded by some of the Christian intellectuals. And your book is trying to take aim at that and kind of present an alternative hypothesis. And this is from the 2nd page of your book. You're going to challenge this assumption. Quote, I do this by suggesting that Christianity was not always a defining factor in how Christian intellectuals were regarded by imperial authorities and other elite figures in the Roman Empire. So it wasn't their Christianness that mattered so much to the emperors and other intellectuals. Christian intellectuals were also regarded as intellectuals and judged for the culture and philosophy that they displayed. In short, Christian intellectuals often behaved in ways that avoided, de-emphasized, or complicated the simple claim of, quote, I am a Christian, end quote. Rather than marking themselves off from others, they depicted themselves as full participants in the intellectual culture of the Roman Empire and were judged on this basis, end quote. What was the process of coming to challenge that kind of prevailing vision? What were some of the things you looked for? What were some of the aha moments? And tell me a little bit more about when you say that they were kind of judged on their own standards, not the simple fact of this sentence, "I am a Christian." Why was that not so important, I guess?
Yeah. So I guess that's a couple parts, the question, and I'll try to break down my answer into a couple parts and try to keep this manageable. So I guess the first part of this was really coming back to when I was in graduate school. And I was in graduate school in an ancient history program. And so the faculty members and the people in the program were coming from classics, they were coming from history, they were coming from the university I went to didn't have a religion department. They had a Near Eastern Studies department. And so it was drawing from a whole bunch of different influences, I'd say. And I was working with supervisors who were interested in Christianity, but they also conceived of themselves primarily as Roman historians. And they were always kind of wondering, how do we fit these things together? These are things that are happening at the same time. You know, Christian intellectuals and non-Christian intellectuals are walking the same streets, they're in the same places. And there is this tendency I find in a lot of scholarship on early Christianity that is so interested in zooming in at such a small level, right? At such a close level on the Christians that you start missing what else is going on, basically. And so for me, then, what my process was really starting to think, what can we actually say about the place that Christians had in the Roman Empire? And the same pieces of evidence show up over and over and over again, right? You get that the early Christians as the Romans saw them.
Yes.
You get that sort of perspective, basically.
Robert Louis Wilkin's book.
Yeah, exactly. But you get that perspective, and I mean, Wilkin was pretty broad in terms of the sources that he used for it. But there is this temptation to say, okay, we've got Pliny talking about this in his letters to Trajan. We've got these other passages, you know, in Tacitus, and these other passages, and a few other authors here and there, and then we get more of them as we move on over time. And so part of what I was interested in was saying, how can we actually maybe expand that collection of evidence and that small collection of passages that have been talked about endlessly? And if we can do that by saying, let's think about what sort of intellectuals Christians were and how they would have fit in or not into the norms of intellectual culture in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And then let's see what other non-Christian intellectuals were saying about other intellectuals at that time, basically. So I think that we can actually expand that pool a little bit, and we can make a lot of other evidence relevant for this conversation in ways that, you know, typically I've found have often not really been deemed as relevant. So, you know, that was something that was really fundamental for the book. I'll just say really quickly that, you know, part of the inspiration for this was I was reading Irenaeus, and Irenaeus actually doesn't show up in this book very much, but I published on him a bit in a few other places. And when I was reading Irenaeus, and I was trying to make sense of things in his work, and I wanted to make sense of them not just with reference to the standard set of sources that people look at to try to make sense of him, but I wanted to say, you know, here's a guy writing in Greek in the late 2nd century. There are a lot of other guys writing in Greek in the late 2nd century, and they're talking about similar types of things. We can make better sense of Irenaeus if we read him alongside a larger group of other authors who were active at the same time, and also knowing some things that we know about Irenaeus, where he was from. Irenaeus makes a lot more sense if you approach him from this bigger vantage point. And so that became the starting point for all the other sort of stuff that I did in this book, which is then saying, well, if we're talking about Justin Martyr, we're talking about Tatian, we're talking about Julius Africanus, we're talking about Origen, who are all the other people who were around at the same time who can help us make sense of different things that show up in their works?
Yeah, in some ways, your book is comparable, not quite as big, but it's comparable to like Christoph Marxi's book on, theology and its institutions in the early Roman Empire, where he kind of looks at Christianity, the sort of different kind of philosophical schools within Christianity, and does some comparative work with the other philosophical schools that were going on at the time. It's very similar to what you're trying to do. You're trying to put these intellectuals like Justin, Tatian, Africanus, Origen, contextualize them by looking at them alongside their contemporaries. What were they doing? How are they debating? And this gets into your first chapter. An important concept in your first chapter is Evgenia, or eugeneia, however you prefer to pronounce it, depending on who your Greek teacher was. But it means a noble birth, nobility, good birth. It talks about somebody coming from a good, strong family line, basically. And you start with Emperor Claudius's speech about the inhabitants of an island and their noble ancestry. Tell us, can say a little bit more about the importance of this concept, Evgenia, and why was it so important to Roman, Greco-Roman intellectuals?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of a bigger argument and a bigger sort of thing that I'm interested in, which in one sense is sort of getting at the idea of how people saw, let's call it Greekness, for lack of a better word, right? How people saw sort of, we could maybe call it Hellenism too, but I think Greekness is potentially a better way of describing it. How people saw that as being sort of constituted, how people saw that as being passed along. Was it enough just to speak Greek really well, to speak Attic Greek really purely, or in a way that people would define as pure? Or did you also need to have, did your father and your grandfather and your great-great-grandfather and so on, did they also need to be Greek from these, from, you know, the sort of the Greek homeland, so to speak? And I think that if you go looking for references to this concept of nobility or good birth, is how I often end up translating it, in Greek sources, you start seeing it everywhere. And you start seeing it in ways that indicates that they were a little more exclusive in terms of how they viewed who got to share in being Greek, who got to share in being Greek in this really sort of pure and kind of ancient way, basically. So that became something that you know, I wanted to talk about in a little bit more detail, right? Chapter 1 in the book is the chapter that doesn't talk about Christians at all, right? And I realized that that's the chapter that in some reviews of the book that people don't really talk about at all, because it's a little outside of what reviewers more interested in, which are the subsequent chapters that do talk about Christians. But I think it's really important for situating the authors that I talk about in this, let's call it a competitive, kind of exclusive context of intellectual culture. And I think it helps to explain a little bit more why Christians might not be welcomed in, so to speak. And it's not always because they're Christians, it's more that they're barbarians. They're people who are being regarded as not fitting into this conception of Greek nobility or good birth. You know, they can't explain who their great, you know, 20 times great grandfather is and how he came from, you know, this city that was really associated with this pure and ancient Greek tradition. So that does become a really big component of the context book then, and why somebody like Tatian, who comes right up and says, I'm a barbarian, right? I really am a barbarian, believe me. Why someone like him, you know, explaining why he's responding and why he's talking in the way that he is about Greekness and about how he relates to it.
So at this time, you mentioned in this chapter, in the city of Rome itself, Greek is still spoken and written quite extensively. Latin was still the kind of the official language, but there was pretty substantial literature and people probably walking around speaking Greek in the city of Rome. And also you get in Alexandria, where in Alexandria, Egypt, a very cosmopolitan Greek city, how the citizens of that city kind of separated themselves off from Egypt at large. So you had the Egyptians, which would be pretty much everybody except the citizens of Alexandria, who would have considered themselves Greek. And then in the Holy Land, you know, you have Jews, you have more Semitic languages, but you still also have a pretty strong prevalence of Greek. So Greek was still kind of the lingua franca of the empire at the time. And I think that's what your chapter is trying to get at. And it's living in a cosmopolitan world at the time. It's being kind of confronted and challenged by these other cultures, and it's trying to respond to that. I don't know, is that kind of accurate to what you'd say you're getting at?
Yeah, it is. And a big part of chapter 1 is then figuring out or trying to talk about how Greek authors were sort of adapting themselves to the reality of the Roman Empire too. And then sort of saying, well, what's the relationship between Rome historically and Greece historically? What's the relationship actually between the Latin language and Greek and things like this? And I do have a whole section in the first chapter that really talks about this theory that Latin was actually a dialect of Greek and so on. That whole sort of line of argumentation. And then this idea that somehow, in a roundabout way, the Roman Empire is actually helping Greece restore itself to the glories of the Greek past, basically. So that becomes another major component in here. And again, why it's not just the Greeks who are going to be hostile to people who don't fit in with Greek culture, but it's also going to be Romans, right, who are going to be hostile to people who don't really fit in so much with particular types of Greek culture.
So now one could say, what about Pythagoras? Because he would have been a Persian, correct? If I'm not mistaken. Do we know really where he came from?
Well, that's one of the, I'll admit I'm no expert on Pythagoras by any means, but he's one of those early philosophical figures that there were debates about where he was from.
Yeah.
There were debates about what his intellectual heritage was too. So one of the authors I talked about later in the book, Diogenes Laertius, who writes these, these biographies, basically a collective biography of philosophers. He's very interested in claiming that Greek philosophy was all Greek from the outset, and that there weren't these other sorts of influences, Near Eastern or whatever else, behind Greek philosophy. So I think what becomes really interesting then is just saying that, figures like Pythagoras and then these other early Greek philosophers, some people wanted to look at them and make them be very, very Greek and not have any sort of other connections. And other people wanted to look at them and say, okay, here's proof that, Greek philosophy isn't quite as Greek or is quite as ancient as the Greeks claim it is.
And there were these debates, I think you bring it out in your book too, where, especially among early Christians, they're like, well, okay, Plato said all this stuff and Socrates said all this stuff, but Moses came first. They learned it. They learned some of the stuff by reading some of the Hebrew scriptures. So there's a lot of debate about tracing one's intellectual and spiritual patronage back further. Who can go further back as a form of legitimacy? I think that's very strong. You see that all over in patristic literature, especially of the the second and third centuries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's something that's definitely present in the book, especially in the chapter about Tatian, who is one of our better sources for those sorts of arguments and ideas. Yeah.
So let's get into some of these Christians now. There are four Christians that you focus on here: Justin Martyr, mid-second century philosopher who taught probably in the upstairs of a bathhouse. Then you have one of his students, Tatian, who was subsequently deemed a heretic by Orthodox Christians. Then you have, in the third century, you go to Sextus Julius Africanus and Origen. So let's start with Justin Martyr. And this quote really kind of struck out to me as what kind of the point you're getting at here. Quote, Justin should be considered an ambitious intellectual, working with the goal shared by so many of his counterparts of being noticed by the imperial household. Justin, however, seems to have struggled to gain any attention from non-Christian intellectuals because of some basic gaps in his education that would have branded him as an amateur in the eyes of the city's elite intellectuals. So there's a number of things you bring out there. On the one hand, Justin doesn't leave a lot of literature, but he does leave two apologies addressed to the Roman emperor. And I think that's where you're getting this. You focus specifically on his second apology. And also, Justin confesses that he really lacks a lot of the preparatory education that most of his contemporary Greco-Roman philosophers would have had coming up as young adults, adolescents. And that kind of that's treated as a mark against Justin because you say he's not really taken that seriously, or he's not really noticed as much by his non-Christian intellectuals. So let's take these one at a time. First, What is Justin doing in a second apology when he writes to the emperor? What's he trying to do there?
Yeah. So this is one where I often end up disagreeing with other people, and I realize this when I say this. But I think that there is in Justin's second apology, I think that what he's doing is he's behaving in the way that other intellectuals in Rome at the same time are behaving. He's trying to get their attention, the attention of the emperors, that is, and he's trying to stand up for himself and for Christians to a certain extent, and trying to say, we're legitimate philosophers, pay attention to us.
Yeah.
And he realizes that by doing this, he may end up dying, right? He may end up being executed, and he's fairly frank about that too, actually. But I think that the challenge here then becomes how much we say Justin by sort of speaking up in this way. Is he just pretending? Is this just for show? Or is this someone who's actually putting a petition forward to the imperial household and saying, pay attention to me? And for me, I think it's very much pay attention to me. And I think that there's also this element in what Justin is doing is saying that there's a legitimacy that attracts or that sort of adheres basically to philosophers who are willing to die for who they are, basically. Yeah. And I feel that that's what Justin is doing. And I think that, again, we can make very good sense of Justin, especially because he's still early enough, right? He's really, in some sense, our first Christian intellectual we really know anything significant about. I realize that we can have a whole debate about what Paul counts as.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But, Justin is the first Christian intellectual that we can really sort of see what he's doing and see how he's presenting himself and things like this. And what he's doing fits in so well in some respects with what other philosophers in the late first and early second century are doing in terms of their interactions and relationships with the imperial household. They're saying, in effect, pay attention to me, and we're interested in getting to know you and having you get to know us. But they're also saying, if you put us to death or if you exile us, you're just demonstrating our legitimacy. Yeah. And again, I think that that's fundamental to Justin's self-presentation and his project, especially in the second apology.
This seems to be an issue that philosophers face. And you say this, not just Christian philosophers, but pretty much all philosophers face. And really, I mean, I suppose they probably thought of themselves as being in the same lineage as Socrates, who was put to death. There's all kind, Origen's preface to, I think it's the preface to Contra Celsum, really kind of draws a comparison between Socrates's martyrdom or his persecution and the death of Jesus Christ himself. But he says Christ's death was better, of course. But this is present in philosophical discourse, and I think you brought that out in this chapter. It wasn't just Christians; it was a lot of different philosophers, and Justin probably did know that writing to the emperor, appealing for respect to Christians and treat us like proper intellectuals and give us some respect, was maybe putting himself in a little bit of danger.
And I think that the real sort of debate that I've gotten into with some people on this chapter is just how much Justin is sort of willingly doing this, so to speak. And I realize we don't know what Justin was thinking. And I think Justin's self-presentation is more complicated than people made it out to be, because sometimes people do say Justin is simple. He doesn't have that good, his education isn't that great, so we can't expect that much from him. But I think we can expect a little bit more. I think he's more sophisticated than he often seems. But at the same time, then there's this pose that comes forward of, if you exile me, if you punish me, if you put me to death, you're just proving my legitimacy as a philosopher. Because look at all these other philosophers that Roman emperors or state authority figures, I guess we could say, have exiled or punished or put to death before. And this is where Justin gets into that sort of really roundabout, interesting argument where he basically says, all the philosophers before us, even before the time of any Christians at all, who did this, they're actually kind of Christians before Christians existed, right?
That's
so
right.
It's basically saying, these other philosophers that had this happen to them, it's not just Justin claiming I'm a legitimate philosopher. It's Justin saying these other guys that had this happen to them, they're also just pretty much Christians too, right? And that proves their legitimacy.
Yeah, and you say that he's one of the earliest Christian intellectuals, and you're right to caveat that. But he's certainly one of the first ones from whom we have a good amount of literature, although we don't have nearly as much as we do from someone like Origen, for example. Yeah. Tons. But, even like in the book of Acts, they have Paul debating with the Stoics and the Peripatetics at the Areopagus. Now, whether that was true or not, Acts, written probably towards the turn of the 1st century, roughly, give or take, reflects that Christians, at least at that time when Acts was written, were starting to engage in public discourse with philosophers. Whether Paul did so 4 or 5 centuries earlier is debatable, but certainly Romans might kind of suggest that he was debating with some Stoics or had some Stoic thoughts. But Justin, yeah, he really is. And one of the more fascinating things about him is he's got this dialogue with Trypho the Jew, where he kind of talks about his own path, testing out different philosophical schools before finally coming up to Christianity and saying this is the true philosophy. And yet it is in the dialogue with Trypho, I think, if I remember correctly, where he says, yeah, okay, I'm a philosopher, but I don't have this training in music and arithmetic and geometry that all these other philosophers that he would have been debating with at the time were trained in before studying philosophy. Let's talk a little bit about that. Justin the philosopher.
Yeah. So what I think is really interesting about that passage in the dialogue with Trypho, or that section in the dialogue with Trypho, is the sort of self-presentation that Justin has there. It matches up so well with what other philosophers in the 2nd century at the same time are complaining about, right? And to a certain extent, I wonder when I read those passages how much, again, that's Justin saying, look at me, here I am, right? There's an element almost of parody or satire here in Justin saying, I went and talked to this one philosopher and he wouldn't take me on as a student because I didn't know this stuff. And I told him, I don't want to know that stuff. And you get the same sorts of stories in other authors from Justin's time. So it's in Galen. Galen's always complaining about how bad the other philosophers of his time are. And it's also there's some passages in Aldous Gellius, which is really one of these great sources for kind of the bilingual intellectual culture of the 2nd century.
Attic Nights.
Yeah, the Attic Nights, exactly. And you get these sorts of stories, of guys who consider themselves philosophers just complaining about the poor training. And then also, and this is the detail that I really liked, they complain about, they get students showing up at their schools or just showing up and talking to them, I guess is probably the better way of putting it. And they say, this is what I want to learn. I don't want to learn this other stuff that you say I need to learn before I can learn the stuff that I want to learn. And Justin, in the dialogue with Trypho, basically presents himself as telling this philosophical teacher, I don't want to learn the stuff that you say that I need to know first. And it just matches up so well with the complaints. And it makes me wonder, how much is this, sort of confirmation of the complaints? Or how much is this Justin just saying, yeah, this is what I'm going to say that I did, because he knows it's exactly what other people will expect of the poorly educated philosopher, the person who doesn't want to bother learning that stuff that the other folks say is absolutely necessary.
And I suppose we should say, for people who are going to listen to this or watch this who might not know, Galen, a very famous doctor, he would perform autopsies and stuff like that on carcasses and stuff in front of a public audience. Wouldn't he just kind of give the audience a little bit of medical knowledge and maybe some good entertainment? But he was the doctor for, who was it? Marcus Aurelius was he the doctor for him? So, and Galen, very critical of Christians. He didn't take Christian intellectuals too seriously. He was very critical of them. And
there's one passage I talked about in the book that's it's only available. It's from Galen, but it's stamped in an Arabic translation of a work that no longer survives in Greek, where Galen is more positive, or at least this bit that maybe Galen is more positive towards Christians, but in other respects, though, Galen is fairly critical of Christians and Jews both, because he says that they're not good enough philosophers, basically. And so Galen considers himself very much a philosopher in addition to being a doctor. And so when he talks about this, and when he talks about what the intellectual climate in Rome is like, because that's where he is, he's in Rome for decades, and he's there at basically the exact same time that Justin Martyr and Tatian are there. So I find him just this almost inexhaustible source of here are things that we can learn about what the intellectual culture was for people like Justin and Tatian in Rome in the 2nd century.
Now, Justin and Tatian probably, I think it's probably safe to say that they knew of Galen. But do you think Justin and Tatian were of the status where Galen probably would have even noticed either of them?
Well, and that's sort of the key point, and one of the things that's really driving this part of the book, the chapter on Justin and the chapter on Tatian, is Galen gives us all this evidence about what it's like to be a philosopher or an intellectual in Rome in the mid-2nd century. And he talks about how he'd have these sort of public, sometimes sort of semi-public debates with other philosophers. And what he basically says, I do these with philosophers from the legitimate schools. He doesn't really call them that as such, but he's talking about people who are in the Platonic school, people who are in the Aristotelian or Peripatetic school. He's talking about Stoics. And then he also says, and also there might be some other people around who are learned enough, and they especially know all those things that Justin Martyr says he doesn't know, right? They know geometry, they know music, they know arithmetic, they know those sort of preliminary subjects that are important for philosophers to have known, apparently. And so when Galen talks about this, he makes it clear, and that gets back to that point that I made earlier about how can we come up with more evidence for how non-Christians would have regarded Christians. Galen gives us tons of this, I think, when he says, these are the sorts of people that I'm willing to argue with and talk to. Then there are other folks I'm not willing to talk to them. And so a big component of chapter 2 on Justin is thinking about the relationship between Christians and the Cynic school of philosophy.
Yeah.
Because the Cynic philosophers were people who typically weren't going to measure up to the standards of other philosophers of the time and to people like Galen. And so when Justin talks about this, and Justin talks about, this argument, this public debate he has with a Cynic philosopher, my argument and my take on that is this is the only guy he could get who would pay attention to him, basically, and who would actually engage him in a conversation or a debate. And Justin is, he's simultaneously bothered by this guy, because if he behaves like a real cynic, it would not have been a very pleasant or kind conversation. Yes. But at the same time, he's happy, I think, that someone paid attention to him, that he could have this sort of public debate with someone, which in one sense was almost a recognition of his legitimacy as a philosopher. But looked at from another vantage point, other people might look at this and say, oh, you got a cynic talking to you. Who cares? They talk to anybody. They'll abuse anybody that they encounter. So what does that really matter for anything? But Justin presents this as, this is a big deal, right? I had this public debate with this Cynic philosopher, and he tells the emperors this, and he says, you might have heard about this already. They haven't heard about this
already. They hadn't heard about it, yeah.
They really haven't. But Justin says, you might have heard about this, and if you're interested, I'll tell you all about what we talked about. I'll even debate him again right in front of you if you want to do this. And this is so much like how Galen talks about himself. Galen is always making a big deal of that famous time. Famous, right? Yeah. That famous time that he had an argument with a philosopher, and everyone in the city knew about it. No one in the city knew, well, a few people in the city knew about it, right? But again, Justin and Galen, I think, have an awful lot in common in that sense, where they're always talking about how someone paid attention to me. I got in this argument with someone, and you might have heard about it, right? There's this real dynamic there in terms of what Justin says about himself in the Second Apology, how he presents himself. And again, there's so much similarity, I think, between how Galen talks about himself, where Galen says, everybody in the city knew about what I'd done and what I'd said. And everybody knew this famous moment when I got in this big argument with this other philosopher, and he stormed off. And anyway, this is something that I think is, again, just really fundamental to what we see about Justin's self-presentation.
Yeah. Take me seriously. I am a legitimate intellectual, and I can prove it to you.
Yeah.
Before we move on to Tatian, I did want to ask, the thought occurred to me, as we were talking about his dialogue with Trypho and how he didn't want to learn the preparatory studies, the encyclopedia, of the schools. What do you think that says about like Justin's own upbringing? Like what, because I mean, not every family could put their children through that rigorous program of studies. They could probably get them through grammatical education, but some of those more advanced forms of education, probably not. What do you think that says about him and his upbringing?
Yeah, I think it does say something about his social status. It says something about the wealth that his family had. And I think it also might even say something about how early he started. I'm going to compare him to Galen again. Galen makes it really clear that he had a better education than most other folks of
And he
his
probably
time did.
did. He probably
I
did.
think, yeah, and I think he did. And he talks about it in terms of how many years he spent, how much he traveled, how much money went into it. And again, that's something that shows up all across his works, and then just even in terms of who he is and what he accomplishes and how much he writes and so on. And Justin, there had to have been money there. There had to have been an opportunity for him to travel. He's not from Rome, but he ends up there, right? He makes his way there. He does have enough literacy to do everything that he does. He can present himself as a teacher, as a philosopher, all of these things, but he's not at the same level of standing as someone like Galen and someone like these really, really wealthy guys who come from these huge traditions of scholarship and everything else.
And that'll kind of re-emerge as we talk about Africanus and Origen a little bit later. That's part of the reason why I asked that. So let's move on to Tatian. So Tatian is Justin's student, very good, legitimate intellectual in his own right. He's famous for his Diatessaron, which is kind of what is it? It's like a collage of the Synoptic Gospels. Although I don't know how much of it is extant. I think only small fragments, probably, or reconstructions from scholars. I don't know. I haven't done a lot of work on Tatian yet. Mark Crawford would probably be a good person to talk to about that.
Yeah. So that's an area of Tatian that I'll admit I know less about, in part because the scholarship on it is sort of its own world, basically. But there are extant pieces of this sort of, what should we even call it? This blending together of the Gospels.
Yep.
But they survive in such a different tradition of languages, and there's a lot of complexity associated with figuring out what do we actually have here. And again, working across in some cases 10 or more languages to try to figure out what exactly is going on with this work. So that's never an area that I've tried tackling, I'll be honest.
No, and but you do tackle one of his very important works, Ad Graecos, to the Greeks or against the Greeks, and he kind of flips the script a little bit. You say he's like, I am a barbarian, and I'm damn proud to be a barbarian. You Greeks are idiots. So one of the things I found fascinating. Okay, so you get into this, and I can't remember if I marked it or not, but one of the things Tatian says in his criticism of the Greeks is that they don't agree on anything. They have all these, different philosophical schools that can't agree with each other. Now, Celsus, mid to late 2nd century philosopher, wrote a treatise against the Christians, to which Origen responds. He makes a very similar argument about Christians. Like, you guys can't agree on anything. That's a sign that you're not a legitimate philosophy. You're not a legitimate way of life. Tatian takes the opposite and says, no, it's you Greeks who can't agree with anything. So why are you criticizing us? You're not the legitimate ones. I found that very striking.
Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of scholarship and debate about the relationship between these different figures, right? So, people have definitely made arguments about what works is Celsus familiar with, which Christian authors are familiar with Celsus's works and things like this. I'll admit it's one that I mostly ended up sidestepping in terms of that debate. Besides saying that there are some parallels and there are some It should be some points where we can kind of imagine these people talking to each other, maybe not talking to each other as such, but these people being familiar with the ideas and what the other people are saying, whether that's directly or whether they're just familiar with it in a more general sense.
Kind of part of the thought world, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Tatian, and this is a big part of your book, because your main argument is that these Christian intellectuals are trying to get the attention of these elites and say, take us seriously. We're just as legitimate as you are. Tatian is kind of an outlier in this regard. Why does he emphasize? And first of all, I guess before you answer that question, why he emphasizes his barbarianness, what did the term barbarian mean at this time? We're not talking about Conan here.
Yeah. So I guess when we're talking about barbarian, I mean, barbarian still has that sense of not Greek, right? You can divide the world up into two categories, Greek, and not Greek equals barbarian. But there's this also this other legacy associated with the virtues of barbarians. There's this other legacy associated with the idea that maybe it was the barbarians who taught the Greeks some things like this. So, Tatian knows about all of this, and he really plays with this category and the relationship between Greeks and barbarians, especially because, and he points out things, and he's absolutely right about some of this. Tatian points out some things where he says, well, you Greeks have all these different things, and you even have these different ways of speaking Greek. You've got these different dialects. Why do you think this one dialect, this one form of Greek is more Greek than these other ones, right? You guys can't even figure out what counts as Greek, so why should I be bothered by this, right? I'm not going to pretend to be Greek. Although the really interesting and fascinating thing about Tatian is he's giving this performance in a way that's basically signaling, look at how smart I am in Greek things, right? And look at how well I can pull off all of these things that you would normally expect from a really sophisticated Greek intellectual. And then he comes out and says, wait a sec, I'm actually not Greek at all, but look at what I can do, right? So there's this sense that Tatian is kind of trying to deconstruct all of these categories and playing with stuff in all of these different types of ways, which again, I think makes him just really fascinating in terms of everything that he's doing there.
Now, by birth, he wasn't a Greek, was he? He'd be from what, modern day Syria or northern Iraq? Isn't that about where he came from?
Yeah, that's what we know in terms of his biography or in terms of the biographical tradition. And Tatian comes out and says, he says, I'm a Syrian, right? With an A. He doesn't say I'm Syrian. He says I'm a Syrian, which is also a way of suggesting I'm from this really ancient people in this ancient civilization. Whereas sometimes other people will just call him Syrian, which I take to be a more sort of derogatory way of referring to him, where people are trying to take away that sort of idea of you're an Assyrian versus you're Syrian, right? That's sort of the distinction that I think is there in some of the references to him.
The way you describe what a barbarian would have been to the Greeks, probably comparable to what a Gentile would have been to the Jews, the people of the Old Testament, right? Pretty much, if you're not Jewish, if you're not Hebrew, you're a Gentile, right? You're somebody from the nations. And that's probably something along the lines of what the Greeks sort of thought of barbarians, although, they ridiculed barbarians quite a bit for some of what they thought were pretty ridiculous religious practices. They were brutal on the Egyptians for some of their own ritual worship.
Yeah, I think that the key point is recognizing that they're claiming that there's a binary, even though there's all sorts of signs where people are realizing this isn't a binary, right? That there's a spectrum, and that there's lots of other alternatives, right? Besides just saying they're Greeks and they're barbarians and there's no one else, even if Greek authors like pretending that that's what it was. You're either Greek or you're not.
So the interesting thing here is we got Justin Martyr, who's Tatian's teacher, and Justin is really trying to appeal to the emperor, saying, we're just as Greek as you, kind of, in a way. And then you have a student who's doing something quite different. That's a pretty interesting dynamic. I kind of wonder what the classroom would have been like.
Yeah, and this is that territory where we do just have to wonder about things. We start thinking about who was there in that classroom or whatever the location was, whether it was what we would call the classroom or not. You know, you start wondering about things like I mentioned Irenaeus earlier, and Irenaeus, we have good reason to believe, was in Rome at the same time
Yeah.
that Justin and Tatian were there. And Irenaeus talks about Tatian. Did they actually know each other? And I think that they may have, but we don't know that for sure. And so there's all of this sort of murkiness when we have this feeling of, you know, who all was there in Rome at the same time as some of these guys. And Tatian does make it clear that he knows about some stuff that Justin said or wrote that we don't have, right?
Yes.
Tatian references Justin a couple times in ways, and we don't actually have that showing up in any of Justin's extant works. So Tatian knows more about Justin than we do, definitely. Like that's unquestionable on that front. Um, so I do think that I'm moving back to Justin now, but you know, I think that there's even more to Justin than we realize, in the sense when we see Tatian talking about him and saying these things, and we're saying we don't actually have that in Justin's works. So what's going on here?
So with Tatian, so I mentioned his to the Greeks, or again his treatise against the Greeks. An important part of this chapter for you, so, and you've kind of talked about, he's really showing that while on the one hand he's claimed to be a barbarian, he's telling everybody, all the Greeks, that he knows all this stuff about Greek traditions. And this is an important part of your chapter where you kind of look at the genre of against the Greeks, and you call it a miscellany. So what was a miscellany at the time, and why is it important for reading Tatian in this way?
Yeah, so that genre, I mean, another way of describing it could be something that's not quite encyclopedic in size, but encyclopedic in the scope of what the person claims to know about. So that genre of a miscellany for Tatian, what I'm suggesting about the work against the Greeks is that I think he gives all these little clues throughout the work by some use of some key phrases and some key sort of transition points in the work, where he's basically saying, I know everything about you. I know everything that there is to know about Greek culture. So the work, I describe it a couple times, is like an encyclopedia in miniature. It's not a very long work, right? Like it's pretty short, but he moves through his subject material in ways that don't seem very organized. And so often, sometimes people who don't think much of Tatian will just say, he's just making it up as he's going along. He's just, you know, ranting about all of these different things with no real purpose or anything like this. And I think the work makes a lot more sense and is a lot more interesting if we say, yeah, he's trying to do that. He's trying to demonstrate this kind of encyclopedic command of different topics, and he's trying to put it together in this form that would be recognizable to readers as something like a miscellany. And in that sense, what I think is really important is a miscellany was often a genre, not exclusively, but it was often a genre where people whose credentials might be attacked, that was a genre that they liked using because it was a way of saying, look at everything that I know, look at how legitimate that I am. I talked about this a little bit in the chapter, that a few of the people that we know about who wrote works of this type, one of them was a woman, which on its own would be enough for people to say you're not a legitimate intellectual, right? There would be many misogynists and chauvinists and so on who would say that outright. One of the other people who wrote like an encyclopedic type work, a miscellany, was this guy named Favorinus, who's really famous for being he was born in Gaul. He was born in modern France, but he knew so much about Greek culture, even though he was born in this, you know, backwater outskirts of the world, basically. And Favorinus is also really famous because he was potentially born with an intersex condition that people would refer to him as a hermaphrodite or as a eunuch or things like this. And so for me, what I think is really interesting, that we have these people who are in kind of liminal positions or kind of outsiders. They're using this genre of a miscellany or this encyclopedia to try to demonstrate, look at my legitimacy, look at all of this stuff that I actually know about things. And so I think Tatian is doing a similar type of thing. He's realizing that this is an advantageous genre for him to use and exploit and explore. And he can say, look at my legitimacy with this collection of stuff that I'm able to weave together and put together. And again, I think it makes it so much more interesting as a work if you look at it as a miscellany rather than just saying this is a disorganized apology, which I think has been often one of the standard ways of looking at the work, especially from people who are sort of just saying Tatian's a heretic. What do we care about him anyway?
Well, that kind of gets to the issue with Tatian. I mean, on the Orthodox Christianity rejected him. He's kind of labeled as a heretic. Did he have any more success than Justin in being recognized by some of his non-Christian contemporaries? Do we know?
We don't have any real evidence to suggest that. We really don't. Tatian is someone who has a legacy, right? I mean, the story and the biographical tradition about him is that he leaves Rome and he goes back east. He goes back where he's from, and he kind of establishes his own thing there. There are people who are still reading his mixture of the Gospels. Centuries later, there are still people who will sort of follow in his tradition and in his teachings later on. Tatian's interesting because he also, one way of looking at him is he's an early Christian ascetic, in the sense that he's interested in, he seems to be a vegetarian, for instance. He seems to be interested in not having sex, things like this, basically. And so there are these traditions that continue to be associated with him later on. But in terms of any awareness of him from others, we don't really have any evidence for that, except to say that a lot of later Christian authors were still pretty interested in Tatian, even though they knew and were quite adamant that he was heretical.
Yeah. Now, after Tatian, so you get into Julius Africanus and Origen. Something happens that's pretty crucial in the empire at this time that you kind of argue paved the way for Christian intellectuals to be noticed, and that's the dynastic shift from the Antonines to the Severins. How important was that shift? Who were these Severins?
Yeah, so I think that the real key point that I make about the Severins is really that they're coming from different parts of the empire, and they're drawing their support from different groups of people than the previous emperors did. So the Antonines, Marcus Aurelius, and others in that dynasty are figures who they fit in to a large extent with older standards about where the empire is. They're more interested in Italy. They're more interested in Greece and Asia Minor. They're interested in those, let's maybe call them more central geographically spots, and spots that were often regarded as more central culturally, right? The sort of the big destinations, not so much the cosmopolitan places, but the spots where everyone wants to go to these spots, basically. The Severins, when they came around, they've got connections to Africa. They've got connections also through marriage and eventually, right, when the children are born in this dynasty, they've got connections also to the Near East. And when they end up taking power, one of the things that's very significant in this time is there's a lot of infighting and civil wars and things like this. So who are they going to get their support from? And one of the things that I argue in the last chapter of the book is really about how they're giving new opportunities to people in the empire who wouldn't have gotten those opportunities before under earlier emperors, because these guys, the Severins, are interested in people from Africa. They're interested in people from the Near East. And so they're kind of opening the door for them to have more influence in the empire than these earlier emperors would have been.
And Alexander was the first one, correct? He was the first Severin, if I'm not mistaken. Septimius.
Septimius, yeah.
And I bring that up because, according to Eusebius, Origen's father, Leonidas, was arrested and executed during a persecution, an isolated persecution in Alexandria. And he was beheaded during the reign of Septimius Severus, which kind of supports your argument that it's not so much about an increasing sympathy towards Christianity on the part of these emperors, but it also suggests, the beheading anyways, the nature of the execution, what kind of a person, what social status Origen's father perhaps had. But before you get into Origen, you talk about Africanus. and so Sextus Julius Africanus, he's got the trio nomina. He's a Roman citizen. This is a Christian intellectual who's a Roman citizen, and he's invited to speak, and he's speaking with Alexander, correct? Because you have these two scenes with Africanus. He's invited to talk to Alexander, and then you have Origen. They were friends and colleagues, exchanged letters with each other, who's invited to speak to Alexander's mother, Julia Mamaea. So these are two episodes that set the stage for this chapter on what happens in the 3rd century. You want to take it from there? What's going on here with Africanus and Origen?
So I'll do Africanus first, because I think Africanus is endlessly fascinating, and I think he's also one of these Christian intellectuals that people don't pay as much attention to, because he's a little weird. And honestly, we don't have that. We have a fair amount of his writings, but we don't have anything. Well, we have some of his letters that are complete, but his bigger works, though, we just have pieces of them. So we don't have all of them. And what's really interesting and what's really important for me for Africanus, we have these pretty big sections of this work that he wrote, and it's typically called in Greek the testoi, in Latin the testi, which is just a way of basically saying, the title is a clever way of saying this is a miscellany, basically, is what it's coming down to in one sense.
He's a polymath, basically.
Yeah. Africanus is somebody who presents himself as knowing everything about anything that you'd ever want to know about. And Africanus, in this one work, this miscellany that he writes, this is the least Christian work from antiquity, basically, because there's no sign in it anywhere that it was written by a Christian, but we know from a lot of different circumstances and details that it was written by this guy who was a Christian, and who was a Christian before he wrote it, even though people sometimes argue he can't have been Christian to write this, right? That sort of thing. So Africanus, we just know these tantalizing little pieces about him. We know that he's from the city that we'd now call Jerusalem, but it's the city that Africanus calls Aelia Capitolina, which is to say that was the city that the Romans kind of refounded after stuff happened in Jerusalem in the 1st century, and when they said Jews don't get to live here anymore and things like this. So Africanus says, I'm from the Roman colony of Aelia Capitolina. So he's from Jerusalem, but he doesn't call it that, right? And he's Christian, and he travels all over. We get these pieces of him traveling around. He's looking for ancient books wherever he goes. He's talking to people. He's learning whatever he can about everything. He knows this really famous Christian intellectual who we can call either Bardaitsan or Bardesanes. He knows him and tells us a whole story about what a great archer Bardaitsan was. And it's this fascinating bit. So Africanus is this guy who I think really represents this new era under the Severans. He's from the Near East. He's from one of these Roman colonies in the Near East that matter so much to the Severan dynasty because they're drawing on them for support, right? When they're trying to make themselves legitimate as a dynasty and trying to establish themselves. And Africanus travels around everywhere, all over the Near East. And then all of a sudden we know he's in Rome. And in Rome, we have this really tantalizing glimpse that he's an architect, that he's designed this new library for the emperor in Rome, and it's attached to the Pantheon. So that building that you can still go see in Rome these days, theoretically at least, Africanus tells us this. Yeah. You know, I built this new library in the Pantheon, or next to the Pantheon, for the emperor, and oh yeah, a copy of my book is there too, basically. Right? There's all of these wonderful details that come across in just these little snippets about Africanus. And for me, then, he really symbolizes, as I said already, this new type of intellectual, this guy who's getting doors opened for him now because there's this new dynasty there. And as far as we can tell, in terms of what the evidence actually suggests, it doesn't matter that he's a Christian at all. It matters that he's a smart guy from this area that really matters for the Severan dynasty, and he can do stuff for him. Again, he may well have been an architect if we can take him at his word that he did design and build this new library for the emperor.
So Africanus and Origen, so we know that they're friends. We know that they each had a a philosophical school, Origen in Caesarea, which is probably about a 90-minute drive, I think, from modern day Jerusalem. And you have Africanus in Jerusalem. And one of the letters that they exchange has to do with the story of Susanna in the book of Daniel. Modern biblical critics really marvel at how brilliant Africanus's evaluation of the story of Susanna was, and the evidence he presented to suggest that it's a spurious document. He's like, there are Greek plays on words that you would not find anywhere in the Hebrew tradition. Origen writes a very lengthy response back, refuting the claim. And I think most scholars would agree with Africanus's assessment that it's not an original part of Daniel, although Origen's main point was, well, we shouldn't remove it from our canon. So you get this interaction between these two intellectuals at this time debating a biblical passage, and you see how intelligent they were. And they're both invited to speak to the imperial family. Now, with Origen, Eusebius tells us, going to Julia Mamaea, but we don't really know the content of that discussion. Was it religious? Was it philosophical? What can you say about that encounter?
Yeah, and there's not much to say about that encounter besides the little bit that Eusebius tells us about it, right?
That's the only evidence we have, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that what we have there is, I mean, we do have another sign of an imperial interaction. We do have a sign of, a Christian intellectual catching the attention of the imperial household. But I think what's interesting, if you put some pieces together about Origen, and I will admit, I'll just mention this as a side note, a lot of reviewers are not fully satisfied with my treatment of Origen in the book, in part because it's not very long, and I realized that it's not very long, and that was intentional, actually. But if we think about other things about Origen, and we think about what we know about him, I think that Origen knows how intellectuals are meant to behave. He knows how intellectuals are supposed to behave, especially when they're talking to emperors or members of the imperial household, basically. And so my read on that interaction with the emperor's mother is basically Origen is summoned. He makes it seem like he doesn't want to go, which is absolutely standard for how intellectuals would depict that, right? You're going to have to force me, but I guess I'll come along anyway, right? That sort of thing. There's a little bit of a dynamic of that in that case with Origen. And then the other implication, and this is something that people have tried putting together based on what we know about what Origen was busy with at the time, is that Origen continued to keep busy with the stuff that he was working on, as if to say, I'll come and talk to you, but I'm an important intellectual and I'm busy with these other things. So, you're not going to get my undivided attention, that sort of dynamic. So that's my read a little bit on it. Again, we just have so little to go on besides the story in Eusebius. And I will say that I have so many questions about all of the evidence that Eusebius gives us for Origen, right? I have questions even about some of the details we were talking about before. If we can trust all of these things about Origen's father's name, Origen's father being beheaded, all of these sorts of things, because, Eusebius has his own agendas and his own things that he's doing when he's putting together that life of Origen.
Yeah, and I mean, it's very difficult for a historian when there's only one piece and it's literary evidence.
Yep.
That's not corroborated, so it does make it very hard. But we do know that Origen traveled all over the place. He writes about it at times, and yet he's still able to produce this vast literary output, which is rivaled only by Augustine in the ancient world. It kind of reminded me, as you were describing that, of where I did my master's degree at St. John's in Minnesota here. I had a professor, Kevin Cecil. He was a Benedictine. And he came down with a really aggressive form of cancer. It was multiple myeloma. And I went to go visit him in his hospital room. He was in the retirement center. And okay, so he's got really aggressive cancer. I go in there and visit him. He's sitting up on his bed, and he's got a desk out by his bed, and he's got all of his papers thrown about, and he's writing something. I was like, okay, Julia Mamea is not going to bother Origen with getting his stuff done. Cancer is not going to bother this guy. Intellectuals will still get work done, even though they're bothered by certain annoyances, I suppose. It's remarkable how Origen was able to do all that, and it raises questions about his school. How is he able to write all these commentaries and homilies and treatises when he's supposed to be teaching philosophy? At any rate, I digress. So I want to close with a quote that I was very pleased to see. Now, I'm a historical theologian by training. You're more of like a ancient historian by training. But you have this quote in your conclusion that I would like to close with and get a few comments on. Where's this at here? Before Christianity achieved this recognition, however, independent Christian intellectuals engaged deeply with the intellectual culture of the Roman Empire. This engagement, in turn, helps reveal some of the ways in which Christianity was unexceptional and a product of the empire in which it developed, rather than a wholly new phenomenon. The phrase, quote, "I am a Christian," end quote, and thousands of years of Christian exceptionalism have predisposed scholars and the general public to believe otherwise. But we still have definite signs, particularly in some of the works authored by Justin, Tatian, Africanus, and Origen, of the direct and sustained engagement of Christian intellectuals with the imperial household and the broader intellectual culture of the Roman Empire. These works should not be segregated or exceptionalized from the context in which they were written. Rather, they should be approached as part of a broader and more inclusive intellectual history of the Roman Empire, which this book has attempted to provide. Okay. End quote. They should be approached as part of a broader and more inclusive intellectual history of the Roman Empire. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is coming at it from both sides. And by both sides, I mean the approach of people who are interested in early Christianity, what we might say patristic scholars. But then I'm also thinking about it from the perspective of people who study the Roman Empire in the context of a classics department, or maybe in a history department as an ancient historian. There still is this, I don't want to use the word, I don't even know what word would be appropriate. I almost said
just use it.
I was going to say hysteria, but I realized that there's a lot of baggage associated with that word. But, in that sense, the idea of some people who study the ancient world, who study, Greek and Roman history, aren't interested in studying Christian stuff, basically, right? They aren't interested in it. And then there's that other perspective of saying, you go to the SBL meeting, right? The Society of Biblical Literature, and you're surrounded by all these people who, it's the biggest collection of ancient historians in the world in one sense, right? And it just depends on how you look at it. But what I'm really trying to get at in one sense is saying that there are points of contact, there are points of dialogue, there are things that we can get from looking at a broader set of authors or a broader set of literature, a broader set of evidence, rather than saying, I am only studying whatever label that we want to give it, right? I'm interested in Christian literature of the 2nd century versus I'm interested in Greek literature of the 2nd century, right? And when people might say I'm interested in Greek literature of the 2nd century, they might mean Greek, non-Christian, non-whatever other sorts of forms of things, right? There are so many of these little silos or boundaries that people have created about what it is that they study. And the book, in one sense, is really trying to say, there's all of this weird and fascinating literature from the Roman Empire. And most of what I'm studying here is in Greek. Some of it's in Latin too. And I'll admit, I've never ventured that far into any of the other languages that people can study and use to, inform our knowledge of the ancient world besides in just Greek and Latin, right? And that's a whole other world that's also extremely important, obviously. But what I'm trying to suggest too is the sorts of authors that I use in the book. I spent a fair amount of time reading ancient astrological literature. I spent a fair amount of time reading ancient medical literature. I spent a fair amount of time reading all sorts of things that a lot of people don't want to read, basically. And just realizing that some of that can be really significant for understanding things about Christianity. Some of it can be really significant for just understanding what it was like to be an intellectual in antiquity in general. And if we actually read all of that stuff and, we take the time and say, yeah, I'm going to sit down and read ancient astrological literature because I think it can actually tell us some important things, then we can come up with a picture of intellectual culture and intellectual history in antiquity that I think is just much richer, it's more interesting, and it also finds all of these connections rather than saying that, the only people who should read ancient astrological literature are people who are studying that phenomenon on its own, right? I'm just pitching on that as an example, but it's one of many different things that I think can really help us when we're trying to study antiquity, especially these aspects of it.
I think you say this in the book. You might, or maybe I read it somewhere very recently, but wherever I read it, it's absolutely right that in classics departments, if you read an early Christian, it's probably going to be Augustine and probably nobody else, or at least very few. And I think your book brings out that prior to Augustine, there are plenty of Christian writers who deserve to be read in their own right. I just recall a book that was influential for my dissertation was William Johnson's, Readers and Reading Culture. I think that's what it was called, Readers and Reading Culture in the High Roman Empire. But he had Galen and Aulus Gellius and Pliny, but he didn't have any Christian intellectuals at the time. And that's kind of what you're getting at. And then in certain patristics cases, although I think this might be more the case in the North American context. I think the Europeans still do a pretty good job of this, of when they study patristics and the church fathers, they do show that they have read the non-Christian contemporaries and bring them in. So I think there's a lot of room to merge. And I think you're absolutely right in your observation that, reading ancient astrological literature would be vital because Origen he's just all over the astrologers for some of their theories, and he writes a lot about them, and you wouldn't know what they're saying unless you actually read them. So it is very helpful to kind of take this interdisciplinary approach and include all these different sources when we study these figures. So thank you very much and bringing that out. I think that was really well done.
Thank you.
Any final words? Any final word? Like what? If I could come up with a final question here, I guess. I haven't really done this before, a final question, I guess. But if you were to write this book again, might there be other early Christian intellectuals that you would include? I mean, would you try to look at Marcion maybe a little bit more, or Valentinus, or what would you do differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, I think that people have wondered why I didn't talk about Tertullian in the book, for instance.
But he wasn't in Rome.
Well, he probably did go to Rome. We do have
true.
a little bit of evidence for it. But people have wondered why, and this even came up in the review process, right? Why no Tertullian in here? That sort of thing. I think that the reasons why I focused on the authors that I did, we have a fair amount, or in some cases, a lot of what they wrote. We have it in their own words, or as close as we can get to their own words in some cases. And we can also date and locate them fairly precisely, or at least reasonably precisely, considering all of the questions that we have. So people that I had thought about including a little bit more of, Athenagoras. But again, we don't we don't know that much about him, although we can probably date and locate him, excuse me, reasonably accurately or reasonably precisely, but we don't know that much about him. And there's not really a tradition of people writing, or pardon me, we don't have ancient evidence of other people talking about him, or very, very little of it at least. So Athenagoras was one person. I mean, Tertullian was someone else that I thought about too. I think that, you know, there are other people who are sort of in the background here. Clement of Alexandria was someone else too. But again, I feel like the context for Clement is not as clear, and it's also not Rome, which was actually something that was quite significant for this book too. So I mean, if I were to do it again, honestly, I'd probably actually try to say more about Africanus, and I'd probably try to say a bit more about Origen, because I know that they get maybe like 7 pages or 5 pages each, whereas Tatian gets, I don't know, 60 or 70 pages, and Justin Martyr gets 40 or 50 or something like this. But I will say that I have some more stuff coming out, some more stuff that I'm working on. I'm returning to some stuff on Julius Africanus, so I think that I can do him some more justice in the future in terms of getting at some things about him. I'm not sure that I'll ever try to do Origen full justice, just because that's a career in its own right, as I think you well know. There's so much of him. In the same way that I'm not sure that I'll ever try to do Tertullian full justice, again, just because there's so much of him that's out there. So in one sense, then, you know, maybe I would have liked to include a little bit more Marcion. I didn't want to touch Marcion. Again, too much controversy, too much stuff that we just don't know about. We know about him from people who didn't like him, basically. And that's not a good foundation for figuring out stuff about him. So yeah, that's what I'd say then. There will be more for me about Julius Africanus, especially, and I do actually have a chapter coming out that talks more about Justin Martyr and talks more about Tatian, and it also talks about one of the pseudo Justin Martyr works on the resurrection. So one of these many little works that was attributed to Justin Martyr but wasn't by him. So I have something else coming out about the 3 of them again, that kind of looks at them from a slightly different vantage point. So there'll still be more stuff, but again, probably not that much more on Origen. I'll just say that much.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to what you have coming out pretty soon. In the meantime, Dr. Secord, thank you for joining PatristiCast today.
Okay, well, thank you so much, John. Great talking to you tonight.
You bet. Good night or good evening, whatever.